Mort, Part 3. In a landscape that owed nothing to time and space, which appeared on no map, which existed only in those far reaches of the multiplexed cosmos known to the few astrophysicists who have taken really bad acid, Mort spent the afternoon helping Albert plant out broccoli. It was black, tinted with purple. "He tries, see," said Albert, flourishing the dipper. "It's just that when it comes to color, he hasn't got much imagination." "I'm not sure I understand all this," said Mort. "Did you say he made this?" Beyond the garden wall, the ground dropped towards the deep valley, then rose into the dark moorland that marched all the way to the distant mountains, jagged as cats' teeth. "Yeah," said Albert. "Mind what you're doing with that watering can." "What was here before?" "I don't know," said Albert, starting a fresh row. "Firmament, I suppose. That's the fancy name for raw nothing. It's not a very good job of work, to tell you the truth. I mean, the garden's okay, but the mountains are downright shoddy. They're all fuzzy when you get up close. I went and had a look once." Mort squinted hard at the trees nearest him. They seemed commendably solid. "What did he do it all for?" he said. Albert grunted. "Do you know what happens to lads who ask too many questions?" Mort thought for a moment. "No," he said eventually. "What?" There was silence. Then Albert straightened up and said, "Damned if I know. Probably they get answers and serve him right." "He said I could go out with him tonight," Mort said. "You're a lucky boy then, aren't you?" said Albert vaguely, heading back for the cottage. "Did he really make all of this?" said Mort, tagging along after him. "Yes." "Why?" "I suppose he wanted somewhere where he could feel at home." "Are you dead, Albert?" "Me? Do I look dead?" The old man snorted when Mort started to give him a slow, critical look. "And you can stop that. I'm as alive as you are. Probably more." "Sorry." "Right." Albert pushed open the back door and turned to regard Mort as kindly as he could manage. "It's not best to ask all these questions," he said. "It upsets people. Now, how about some nice fry-up?" The bell rang while they were playing dominoes. Mort set to attention. "You'll want the horse made ready," said Albert. "Come on." They went out to the stable in the gathering dusk, and Mort watched the old man saddle up Death's horse. "His name is Binky," said Albert, fastening the girth. "It just goes to show that you can never tell." Binky tried to eat his scarf in an affectionate way. Mort remembered the woodcut in his grandmother's almanac between the page on planting times and the phases of the moon section, showing "Death, the great leveler, comes to all men." He'd stared at it for hundreds of times when learning his letters. It couldn't have been half so impressive if it had been generally known that the flame-breathing horse the spectre rode on was called Binky. "I would have thought something like Fang or Saber or Ebony," Albert continued, "but the master will have his little fancies, you know. Looking forward to it, are you?" "I think so," Mort said uncertainly. "I've never seen Death actually at work." "Not many have," said Albert. "Not twice, at any rate." Mort took a deep breath. "About his daughter of this," he began. "Ah, good evening, Albert, boy." "Mort," said Mort automatically. Death strode into the stable, stooping a little to clear the ceiling. Albert nodded, not in any subservient way, Mort noticed, but simply out of form. Mort had met one or two servants on the rare occasions he'd been taken into town, and Albert was nothing like them. He seemed to act as though the house really belonged to him, and its owner was just a passing guest, something to be tolerated like peeling paintwork or spiders in the lavatory. Death put up with it too, as though he and Albert had said everything that needed to be said a long time ago and was simply content now to get on with their jobs with a minimum of inconvenience to all those around them. To Mort, it was rather like going for a walk after a really bad thunderstorm. Everything was quite fresh, nothing was particularly unpleasant, but there was the sense of vast energies just expended. Finding out about Albert tacked itself on to the end of his list of things to do. "Hold this," said Death, and pushed a scythe into his hand while he swung himself up onto Binky. The scythe looked normal enough except for the blade. It was so thin that Mort could see through it. A pale blue shimmer in the air that could slice flame and chop sound. He held it very carefully. "Right, boy," said Death. "Come on up. Albert, don't wait up." The horse trotted out of the courtyard and into the sky. There should have been a flash or rush of stars. The air should have spiraled and turned into speeding sparks, such as normally happens in the common, everyday trans-dimensional hyperjumps. But this was Death, who has mastered the art of going everywhere without ostentation and could slide between dimensions as easily as he could slip through a locked door. And they moved at an easy gallop through cloud canyons, past great billowing mountains of cumulus, until the wisps parted in front of them and the disk lay below, basking in sunlight. "That's because time is adjustable," said Death, when Mort pointed this out. "It's not really important." "I always thought it was." "People think it's important only because they invented it," said Death somberly. Mort considered this rather trite, but decided not to argue. "Where are we going now?" he said. "There's a promising war in Qa'Rajh," said Death. "Several plague outbreaks, one rather important assassination, if you'd prefer." "What, a murder?" "Aye, a king." "Oh, kings," said Mort dismissively. He knew about kings. Once a year a band of strolling players, or at any rate ambling ones, came to Qa'Rajh, and the plays they performed were invariably about kings. Kings were always killing one another or being killed. The plots were quite complicated, involving mistaken identity, poisons, battles, long-lost sons, ghost witches, and, usually, a lot of daggers. Since it was clear that being a king was no picnic, it was amazing that half the cast was apparently trying to become one. Mort's idea of palace life was a little hazy, but he imagined that no one really got much sleep. I'd quite like to see a real king," he said. "They wear crowns all the time," my granny said, "even when they go to the lavatory." Death considered this carefully. "There is no technical reason why not," he conceded. "In my experience, however, it is generally not the case." The horse wheeled, and the vast flat checkerboard of the Stowe plain sped underneath them at lightning speed. This was rich country, full of silt and rolling cabbage fields, and neat little kingdoms whose boundaries wiggled like snakes as small formal wars, marriage pacts, complex alliances, and the occasional bit of sloppy cartography changed the political shape of the land. "This king," said Mort, as the forest sipped beneath them, "is he good or bad?" "I never concern myself with such things," said Death. "He's no worse than any other king, I imagine." "Does he have people put to death?" said Mort, remembering who he was talking to, added, "saving your honor's presence, of course." "Sometimes. There are some things you have to do when you're a king." A city slid below them, clustered around the castle, built on a rock outcrop that poked out of the plain like a geological pimple. It was one huge rock from the distant Ramtops, Death said, left there by the retreating ice in the legendary days when the ice giants waged war on the gods and rode their glaciers across the land in an attempt to freeze the whole world. They'd given up in the end, however, and driven their great glittering flocks back to their hidden lands among the razor-backed mountains near the hub. No one on the plains knew why they had done this. It was generally considered by the younger generation in the city of Stowe-Lat, the city around the rock, that it was because the place was so dead boring. Binky trotted down over nothingness and touched down on the flagstones of the castle's topmost tower. Death dismounted and told Mort to sort out the nose bag. "Won't people notice there's a horse up here?" he said, as they strolled to a stairwell. Death shook his head. "Would you believe there could be a horse at the top of this tower?" he said. "No, you couldn't get one up these stairs," said Mort. "Well then?" "Oh, I see. People don't want to see what they can't possibly exist." "Well done." Now they were walking along a wide corridor hung with tapestries. Death reached into his robe and pulled out an hourglass, peering closely at it in the dim light. It was a perfectly fine one, its glass cut into intricate facets and imprisoned in an ornate framework of wood and brass. The words "King Olerve the Bastard" were engraved deeply into it. The sand inside sparkled oddly. There wasn't a lot left. Death hummed to himself and stowed the glass away in whatever mysterious recess it had occupied. They turned a corner and hit a wall of sound. There was a hall full of people there, under a cloud of smoke and chatter that rose all the way up into the banner-haunted shadows of the roof. Up in a gallery, a trio of minstrels were doing their best to be heard but not succeeding particularly well. The appearance of Death didn't cause much of a stir. A footman by the door turned to him, opened his mouth, then frowned in a distracted way and thought of something else. A few courtiers glanced in their direction, their eyes instantly unfocusing, as common sense overruled the other 5. "We've got a few minutes," said Death, taking a drink from a passing tray. "Let's mingle." "They can't see me either," said Mort, "but I'm real." "Reality is not always what it seems," said Death. "Anyway, if they don't want to see me, they certainly don't want to see you. These are aristocrats, boy. They're good at not seeing things. Why is there a cherry on a stick in this drink?" Mort said automatically. "It's not as if it does anything for the flavor. Why does anyone take a perfectly good drink and put a cherry on a pole?" "What's going to happen next?" said Mort. An elderly earl bumped into his elbow, looked everywhere but directly at him, shrugged, and walked away. "Take these things now," said Death, fingering a passing canopy. "I mean, mushrooms, yes. Chicken, yes. Cream, yes. I've nothing against any of them, but why in the name of sanity mince them all up and put them in little pastry cases?" "Pardon?" said Mort. "That's mortal for you," Death continued. "They've only got a few years in this world, and they spent them all making things complicated for themselves. Fascinating. Have a gherkin." "Where's the king?" said Mort, craning to look over the heads of the court. "Chap with the golden beard," said Death. He tapped a flunky on the shoulder, and as the man turned and looked around in puzzlement, deftly piloted another drink from his tray. Mort cast around until he saw the figure standing in a little group in the center of the crowd, leaning over slightly the better to hear what a rather short courtier was saying to him. He was a tall, heavily built man with the kind of stolid, patient face that one could confidently buy a used horse from. "He doesn't look like a bad king," said Mort. "Why would anyone want to kill him?" "See the man next to him, with the little moustache and the grin like a lizard," Death pointed out with his scythe. "Yes?" "His cousin, the Duke of Stow-Hillet. Not the nicest of people," said Death. "A handy man with a bottle of poison. 5th in line to the throne last year. Now 2nd in line. Bit of a social climber, you might say." He fumbled inside his robe and produced an hourglass in which black sand coursed between a spiked iron latticework. He gave it an experimental shake. "And due to live another 35 years, he said with a sigh. "And he goes around killing people?" said Mort. He shook his head. "There is no justice." Death sighed. "No," he said, handing his drink to a page who was surprised to find that he was suddenly holding an empty glass. "There is just me." He drew his sword, which has the same ice-blue, shadow-thin blade as the scythe of office, and stepped forward. "I thought you used a scythe," whispered Mort. "Kings get the sword," said Death. "It's a royal what's-name, prerogative." His free hand thrust its bony digits beneath his robe again and brought out King Olaf's glass. In the top half, the last few grains of sand were huddling together. "Pay careful attention," said Death. "You may be asked questions afterward." "Wait," said Mort wretchedly. "It's not fair. Can't you stop it?" "Fair," said Death. "Who said anything about fair?" "Well, if the other man is such a—" "Listen," said Death. "Fair doesn't come into it. You can't take sides. Good grief, when it's time, it's time. That's all there is to it, boy." "Mort," moaned Mort, staring at the crowd. And then he saw her. A random movement in the people opened up a channel between Mort and a slim red-haired girl seated among a group of older women behind the king. She wasn't exactly beautiful, being over-endowed in the freckle department, frankly rather on the skinny side. But the sight of her caused a shock that hot-wired Mort's hind brain and drove it all the way into the pit of his stomach, laughing nastily. "It's time," said Death, giving Mort a nudge with a sharp elbow. "Follow me." Death walked toward the king, weighing his sword in his hand. Mort blinked and started to follow. The girl's eyes met him for a second and immediately looked away, then swiveled back, dragging her head around, her mouth starting to open in an O of horror. Mort's backbone melted. He started to run towards the king. "Look out!" he screamed. "You're in great danger!" And then the world turned into treacle. It began to fill up with blue and purple shadows like a heat-stroke dream, and sound faded away until the roar of court became distant and scritchy, like the music in someone else's headphones. Mort saw Death standing companionably by the king, his eyes turned up towards the minstrel gallery. Mort saw the bowman, saw the bow, saw the bolt now winging through the air at the speed of a sick snail. Slow as it was, he could not outrun it. It seemed like hours before he could bring his leadened legs under control, but finally managed to get both feet to the floor at the same time and kicked away with all the apparent acceleration of continual drift. As he twisted slowly through the air, Death said without rancor, "It won't work, you know. It's only natural that you should want to try, but it won't work." Dreamlike, Mort drifted through a silent world. The bolt struck. Death brought his sword around in a double-handed swing that passed gently through the king's neck without leaving a single mark. To Mort, spiraling gently through the twilight world, it looked as though a ghostly shape had dropped away. It couldn't be the king, because he was manifestly still standing there, looking directly at Death with an expression of extreme surprise. There was a shadowy something around his feet, and a long way away people were reacting with shouts and with screams. "A good clean job," said Death. "Royalty are always a problem. They tend to want to hang on. Your average peasant, now he can't wait." "Who the hell are you?" said the king. "What are you doing here? Guards, I demand—" The insistent message from his eyes finally battered through his brain. Mort was impressed. King Olaf had held on to his throne for many years, and even when dead, knew how to behave. "Oh," he said, "I see. I didn't expect to see you so soon." "Your Majesty," said Death, bowing. "Few do." The king looked around. It was quiet and dim in this shadow world, but outside there seemed to be a lot of excitement. "That's me down there, isn't it?" "I'm afraid so, sire." "Clean job. Crossbow, was it?" "Yes, and now, sire, if you would." "Who did it?" said the king. Death hesitated. "A hired assassin from Ankh-Morpork," he said. Clever. I congratulate Stow-Hellet. Here's me filling myself with antidotes. No antidotes to cold steel, eh? Eh?" "Indeed not, sire." "The old rope ladder and fast horse by the drawing bridge trick, eh?" "So it would appear, sire," said Death, taking the king's shade gently by the arm. "If it's any consolation, though, the horse needs to be fast." "Eh?" Death allowed his fixed grin to widen a little. "I have an appointment with its rider tomorrow in Ankh," said Death. "You see, he allowed the Duke to provide him with a packed lunch." The king, whose eminent suitability for his job meant that he was not automatically quick on the uptake, considered this for a moment, then gave a short laugh. He noticed Mort for the first time. "Who's this? He's dead too?" "My apprentice," said Death, "who will be getting a good talking to before he's much older, the scallywag." Mort said automatically. The sound of their talking washed around him, but he couldn't take his eyes off the scene around him. He felt real. Death looked solid. The king looked surprisingly fit and well for someone who was just recently dead. But the rest of the world was a mass of sliding shadows. Figures were bent over the slumped body, moving through Mort as if though no more substantial than a mist. The girl was kneeling down, weeping. "That's my daughter," said the king. "I ought to feel sad. Why don't I?" "Emotions get left behind. It's all a matter of glance." "Ah, that would be it, I suppose. She can't see us, can she?" "No." "I suppose there's no chance that I could—" "None," said Death. "Only she's going to be queen, and if I could only let her—" "Sorry." The girl looked up and through Mort. He watched the Duke walk up behind her and lay a comforting hand on her shoulder. A faint smile hovered around the man's lips. It was the sort of smile that lies on the sandbanks, waiting for incautious swimmers. "I can't make you hear me," Mort said. "Don't trust him." She peered at Mort, screwing up her eyes. He reached out and watched his hand pass straight through hers. "Come along, boy. No lollygagging." Mort felt Death's hand tighten on his shoulder, not in an unfriendly fashion. He turned away reluctantly, following Death and the king. They walked out through the wall. He was halfway after them before he realized that walking through walls was impossible. This suicidal logic of his nearly killed him. He felt the chill of the stone around his limbs before a voice in his ear said, "Look at it this way. The wall can't be there. Otherwise you wouldn't be walking through it, would you, boy?" "Mort," said Mort. "What?" "My name is Mort." "Mortimer," said Mort, angrily pushing forward. The chill fell behind him. "There. Now that wasn't so hard, was it? Mort looked up and down the length of the corridor, slapped the wall experimentally. He must have walked through it, but it felt solid just now. Little specks of mica glittered at him. How do you do that stuff, he said. How do I do it? Is it magic? Magic is the one thing it isn't, boy. When you can do it by yourself, there will be nothing more that I can teach you. The king, who was considerably more diffused now, said, It's impressive, I'll grant you. By the way, I seem to be fading. It is the morphogenetic field weakening, said Death. The king's voice was no louder than a whisper. Is that what it is? It happens to everyone. Try to enjoy it. How? The voice was now more than a shape in the air. Just be yourself. At that moment, the king collapsed, growing smaller and smaller in the air as the field finally collapsed into a tiny, brilliant pinpoint. It happened so quickly that Mort almost missed it, from ghost to mote in half a second with a faint sigh. Death gently caught the glittering thing, stuffed it away somewhere under his robe. What's happened to him? Said Mort. Only he knows, said Death. Come. My granny says that dying is like going to sleep, Mort added in a shade hopefully. I wouldn't know. I haven't done neither. Mort took a last long look at the corridor. The big doors had been flung back and the court was spinning out. Two older women were endeavoring to comfort the princess, but she was striding ahead of them so fast that they bounced along behind her like a couple of fuzzy balloons. They disappeared up another corridor. Already a queen, said Death approvingly. Death liked style. They were on the roof before he spoke again. You tried to warn him, he said, removing Binky's nose back. Yes, sir. Sorry. You cannot interfere with fate. Who are you to judge who should live and who should die? Death watched Mort's expression carefully. Only the gods are allowed to do that, he added. To tinker with the fate for even one individual could destroy the whole world. Do you understand? Mort nodded miserably. Are you going to send me home? He said. Death reached down and swung him up behind the saddle. Because you showed compassion? No. I might have done it if you had shown pleasure. But you must learn the compassion proper to your trade. What's that? A sharp edge. Days passed, although Mort wasn't certain how many. The gloomy sun of Death's world rolled regularly across the sky, but the visits to the mortal space seemed to adhere to no particular system. Nor did Death visit only kings and important battles. Most of the personal visits were to quite ordinary people, actually. Meals were served up by Albert, who smiled to himself a lot and didn't say much. Isabel kept her room most of the time, or rode her own pony on the black moors above the cottage. The sight of her with her hair streaming in the wind would have been more impressive if she was a better horsewoman, or if the pony had been rather a bit larger, or if her hair was the sort that streams naturally. Some hair has got it, and some hasn't. Hers most definitely hadn't. When he was out on what Death referred to as the duty, Mort assisted Albert, or found jobs in the garden or stable, or browsed through Death's extensive library, reading with a speed and omnivorous common to those who discover the magic of the written word for the first time. Most of the books in the library were biographies, of course. They were unusual in one respect. They were writing themselves. People who had already died, obviously, filled their books from cover to cover, and those who hadn't been born yet to put up with blank pages. Those in between? Mort took note, marking the place and counting the extra lines, estimated that some books were adding paragraphs at the rate of 4 or 5 every day. He didn't recognize the handwriting. And finally he plucked up his courage. A what? Said Death in astonishment, sitting behind his ornate desk and turning his scythe-shaped paper knife over in his hands. An afternoon off, repeated Mort. The room suddenly seemed so oppressively big, with himself very exposed in the middle of a carpet about the size of a field. But why? It can't be to attend to your grandmother's funeral, he added. I would know. I just want to, get out and meet people, Mort said, trying to outstare the unflinching blue gaze. But you meet people every day, protested Death. Yes, I know, only, not for very long, said Mort. It'd be nice to meet someone with a life expectancy of more than a few minutes, sir, he added. Death drummed his fingers on the desk, making a sound not unlike a mouse tap dancing, and gave Mort a few seconds of stare. He noticed that the boy seemed rather less elbows than he remembered, stood a little more upright and bluntly, could use a word like expectancy, was all that library. "All right," he said begrudgingly, "but it seems to me you have everything you need right here. The duty is not onerous, is it?" "No, sir." "And you have good food and a warm bed and recreation and people your age?" "Pardon, sir?" said Mort. "My daughter," said Death. "You have met her, I believe." "Oh, yes, sir." "She has a very warm personality when you get to know her." "I'm sure she has, sir." "Nevertheless you wish." Death launched the words with a spin of distaste. "An afternoon off." "Yes, sir, if you please, sir." "Very well, so be it. You may have until sunset." Death opened his great ledger, picked up a pen, and began to write. Occasionally he'd reach out and flick the beads of an abacus. After a minute, he looked up. "You're still here," he said. "And in your own time, too," he added sourly. Said Mort. "Will people be able to see me, sir?" "I imagine so, I'm sure," said Death. "Is there anything else I might be able to assist you with before you leave on this debauch?" "Well, sir, there is one thing. I don't know how to get to the mortal world, sir," said Mort desperately. Death sighed loudly and pulled open a desk drawer. "Just walk there." Mort nodded miserably and took the long walk to the study door. As he pulled it open, Death coughed. "Boy!" he called and tossed something across the room. Mort caught it automatically as the door creaked open. The doorway vanished. The deep carpet under the foot became muddy cobbles. Broad daylight poured over him like quicksilver. "Mort," said to the universe at large. "What?" said a stallholder beside him. Mort stared around. He was in a crowded marketplace, packed with people and with animals. Every kind of thing was being sold, from needles to, via a few itinerant prophets, visions of salvation. It was impossible to hold any conversation quieter than a shout. Mort tapped the stallholder in the small of the back. "Can you see me?" he demanded. The stallholder squinted critically at him. "I reckon so," he said, "or someone very much like you." "Thank you," said Mort, immensely relieved. "Don't mention it. I see lots of people every day, no charge. Want to buy any bootlaces?" "I don't think so," said Mort. "What place is this?" "You don't know." A couple of people at the next stall were looking at Mort thoughtfully. His mind went into overdrive. My master travels a lot," he said truthfully. "We arrived last night and I was asleep on the cart. Now I got the afternoon off." "Ah," said the stallholder. He leaned forward conspiratorially. "Looking for a good time, are you? I could fix you up." "I'd quite rather enjoy knowing where I am," Mort conceded. The man was taken aback. "This is Ankh-Morpork," he said. "Anyone ought to be able to see that. Smell it too." Mort sniffed. There was a certain something about the air in the city. You got the feeling that it was the air that had seen life. You couldn't help noticing with every breath that thousands of other people were very close to you, and nearly all of them had armpits. The stallholder regarded Mort critically, noting a pale face, well-cut clothes, and strange presence, a sort of coiled spring effect. "Look, I'll be frank," he said. "I could point you in the direction of a great brothel." "I've already had lunch," said Mort vaguely, "but you can tell me if we're anywhere near. I think it's Stolat." "About 20 miles upwards, but there's nothing there for a young man of your kidney," said the trader hurriedly. "I know, you're out by yourself, you want new experiences, you want excitement, romance." Mort, meanwhile, had opened the bag that Death had given him. It was full of small gold coins, about the size of sequins. An image formed again in his mind, of a pale young face under a head of red hair who had somehow known he was there. The unfocused feelings that had haunted his mind for the last few days suddenly sharpened to a point. "I want," he said firmly, "a very fast horse."